Thanks for having me again. So just for this section on fibre, probably my knowledge of fibre is rather limited, but what I'm going to contribute is just a little bit of my research, because my area is largely based on looking at people with type 2 diabetes and of course looking at nutrition for type 2 diabetes. I went down another rabbit hole, as I tend to do. This rabbit hole took a few months' journey actually, and what I wanted to look at was for the carbohydrate sources in the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating and what it said about type 2 diabetes. And this is a bit about what I found. So in the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, we've had Australian dietary guidelines for many years now. So in 1982, revised in 92, 2003 and 2013. And we've always had this emphasis on a high consumption of grains and manufactured grain products. So the Nutrition Australia's food pyramids have been some of the more recognisable visual representations of the guidelines. And grains really do have a really big starring role at the bottom of the pyramid, and often picked in pictorial visualizations of the guidelines often take up more space in that lower area, which is also meant to include our vegetables and legumes as well, but we seem to have a lot of emphasis on the manufactured grain products. So what are grains? So grains include wheat, oat, barley, rice and corn, just to name a few. And these foods, grain foods are those that originate from these grains. So they include bread, pasta, noodles and cereals. So grains are composed of complex carbohydrates as well as protein, and they are a source of B vitamins, vitamin E and other minerals such as zinc, iron, magnesium and phosphorus. So what do the guidelines say? So they do say to eat more grains, and they say to do this to help to reduce weight gain, cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes, and also some cancers. The thing is what I find striking about this is the fact that the incidence of all of these things are actually at an all-time high and are actually ever increasing, despite you know, our guidelines suggesting that we should be decreasing them anyway. So it also says that most adults should eat 6 serves of grains per day to reduce cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes and weight gain. Which is really interesting because the evidence only actually suggests up to 3. What's also interesting is that the guidelines profess that the evidence that they have for this statement is only a probable association. So they are probably right, but they don't really know. And again, you know, when I went through my reading, I found 0 evidence for the benefit of 6 serves of grain, let alone the 3 that are actually then stated in some of the studies. So in the evidence for the statement of eating grains to reduce type 2 diabetes, there were 4 systematic reviews, 3 prospective cohort studies and 4 controlled studies. Funnily enough, 2 of these studies were funded by manufacturers of processed grains, one being Kellogg's and the other being Cargill's, which is a food manufacturer who engages in grain and seed oil production and trading. For me, that's a huge conflict of interest, and probably for most people listening. And I'm not sure why people that are, you know, set to gain lots of monetary reward by putting these studies out there actually influencing what we're eating and what's in our plate. Seems highly ethical to me. But the one thing that I did notice when I looked specifically at the systematic reviews, what I did find was loop after loop after loop. So what I found was, even though we had lots of different studies listed, they were all just referencing each other, and none of them really introduced much new evidence to the table. And the evidence that I did find was rather underwhelming. So 8 of the papers actually compared whole grains to either refined grains or sugar. So Beehole and Co. found that pure glucose resulted in a higher concentration of glucose in the blood than bread. Another group found that brown rice produced a more desirable glucose response than more processed rice. And another one that was quite interesting, Rave and Co. found that insulin resistance was better improved after a whole grain diet rather than that of a meal replacement. Now, in saying that, this meal replacement contained up to 25.5 teaspoons, so that's 102 grams more sugar than the whole grain product. So not particularly an even fight. 7 of the papers did not support grains in reducing type 2 diabetes at all. One study showed that there was no difference in postprandial glucose or insulin response between porridge and bread, suggesting that wholemeal fibre had no impact on glucose tolerance at all. Davy and Co. fed 36 men additional oats or wheat in addition to their normal diets. And over 12 weeks, there was no change to fasting blood glucose or insulin concentration or sensitivity, but funnily enough, they all gained weight. 4 of the papers were unreliable sources of evidence. And, so at best, really, the current evidence for this statement that grains help reduce type 2 diabetes tells us that really whole grains are probably, but are sometimes probably not better than refined grains and sugar at reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes. Sorry, this slide hasn't worked very well, so apologies for that. So basically what we're talking about in terms of the whole grains, and what we find is that the benefit of a low GI grain is actually to slow or prevent the absorption of the carbohydrate in that grain. So if we didn't eat the large amount of carbohydrate in the first place, we wouldn't have to offset the effect of it. Even one of the studies that was listed as evidence for this, for the introduction of whole grains in the diet, proved that fibre was the contributing factor to the reduced risk of type 2 diabetes due to the effects on the glycaemic index. Specifically, insoluble fibre found in whole grains reduced the absorption of carbohydrates, reducing the insulin demand in type 2 diabetes. So eating carbohydrate in the form of whole grains for the benefit of the fibre, that it reduces the absorption of those very carbs, for me is really nonsensical. If you really want to find out where grains reduce risk of type 2 diabetes, perhaps we need to compare them to those people that eat grains to those that don't. And it's also important that if we're talking about insoluble fibre as the benefit here, we can also find them in other food sources, such as eggplant, green beans, broccoli, spinach, kale, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, peanuts, almonds, walnuts, chia, and sesame seeds. So all of these have lower amounts of carbohydrate, therefore less glucose offset by the fibre content. Thank you. That was my findings, and I'll pass over back to Dr. Liz.